The course of history is often shaped not just by wars or revolutions, but by ideas, quietly spoken words that echo across centuries and reshape entire continents. Imagine a single political statement delivered in a formal hall, influencing the destiny of millions and redefining the balance of global power. In the early 19th century, the world was in a state of dramatic transformation. Old empires were weakening, new nations were emerging, and uncertainty filled the air across continents. In the middle of this shifting landscape, the United States introduced a principle that would come to define its role in the Western Hemisphere for generations. This is the story of a doctrine, a strategy, and a vision that changed the Americas forever. But to truly understand its impact, we must go back to a time when the United States itself was fragile, uncertain, and surrounded by powerful empires. In 1776, the United States declared its independence from the British Empire, marking the beginning of a bold political experiment. However, independence did not guarantee security or stability. The new nation was weak, divided, and still struggling to establish its institutions. Powerful empires continued to dominate the global stage, and many of them viewed this new republic with suspicion. To the north, British-controlled Canada remained a constant reminder of imperial power. To the south and west, Spain held vast territories, while French influence lingered in key regions. The young United States found itself surrounded by forces far stronger than itself. Survival was not guaranteed, and every decision carried the weight of uncertainty. In such a dangerous environment, the leaders of this new nation had to think carefully about their place in the world. Early American leaders like George Washington understood the risks of becoming entangled in the conflicts of Europe. At the time, the European continent was constantly at war, with shifting alliances and endless rivalries shaping its politics. For a young nation, still trying to find its footing, involvement in such conflicts could be disastrous. Washington warned against permanent alliances and urged the country to focus on its own development. Thomas Jefferson shared similar concerns, believing that distance from European politics was essential for survival. This cautious approach became known as isolationism, a strategy based on avoiding foreign conflicts while strengthening the nation internally. It was not about weakness, but about patience and long-term vision. The idea was simple: grow stronger first, then decide your role in the world. While the United States focused inward, something extraordinary was beginning to unfold across the rest of the Americas. European empires that had ruled vast territories for centuries were starting to weaken. The spark of change came from Europe itself, where the Napoleonic Wars disrupted traditional power structures. When Napoleon invaded Spain and forced its king to step down, the authority of the Spanish Empire weakened dramatically. This created a rare opportunity for colonies in the Americas to challenge imperial rule. Across the continent, revolutionary movements began to rise. People who had lived under colonial systems for generations now saw a chance to shape their own futures. The winds of independence, once limited to the 13 American colonies, were now spreading rapidly across the hemisphere. In regions like Mexico, Central America, and South America, uprisings began to challenge Spanish control. Leaders emerged who would become symbols of resistance and freedom. Figures such as Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin led campaigns that would eventually break the grip of colonial rule. These were not quick or easy victories. The wars of independence were long, brutal, and filled with sacrifice. Entire cities were destroyed, economies collapsed, and countless lives were lost. Yet, despite these challenges, the desire for independence continued to grow stronger. By the 1820s, much of Latin America had broken free from Spanish rule. New nations appeared on the map, each trying to define its identity and future in a rapidly changing world. However, independence did not mean safety. Across the Atlantic, European powers were watching these developments with concern. After the defeat of Napoleon, major monarchies gathered to restore order and prevent further revolutions. They formed alliances aimed at protecting traditional systems of power and suppressing uprisings wherever they appeared. For them, the independence movements in the Americas represented a dangerous trend. There was a real possibility that European empires might attempt to reclaim their lost territories. For the newly independent nations, this threat was alarming. Their governments were still fragile, their economies unstable, and their militaries weakened from years of conflict. If Europe decided to intervene, the freedom they had just gained could quickly disappear. In the United States, leaders closely followed these developments. The situation raised an important and difficult question. Should the United States remain a passive observer, or should it take a stand to protect the independence of the Americas? The answer would come in 1823, when President James Monroe delivered a message that would later be known as the Monroe Doctrine. It was not a declaration of war or a dramatic show of force. Instead, it was a carefully crafted statement presented during a presidential address. Yet, behind its calm tone was a powerful message directed at the world's most influential empires. The doctrine declared that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization, and that any attempt to interfere would be seen as a hostile act. At the same time, the doctrine included an important condition. The United States promised not to interfere in the internal affairs of European countries or their existing colonies. This was not a call for confrontation, but rather an attempt to establish boundaries. The message was clear. Europe should stay out of the Americas, and in return the United States would stay out of Europe's affairs. However, there was a significant challenge. At the time, the United States did not have the military strength to enforce this doctrine. Its navy was small, and its resources were limited compared to the powerful empires of Europe. The declaration was bold, but its enforcement remained uncertain. Interestingly, the success of this doctrine in its early years depended largely on another power: Great Britain. Unlike other European nations, Britain had strong economic reasons to support independent countries in Latin America. Free nations meant open trade, and open trade meant profit. The British Navy, the most powerful in the world at the time, played a crucial role in discouraging other European powers from attempting to reclaim colonies. While the United States provided the political message, Britain provided the that made it credible. This unexpected partnership helped protect the independence of Latin America during a critical period. As the decades passed, the United States began to grow stronger. Its population expanded, industries developed, and its influence increased. With this growth came a shift in how the Monroe Doctrine was interpreted. What had once been a defensive statement began to evolve into a tool of influence. By the late 19th century, the United States was no longer just warning Europe to stay out. It was actively shaping events within the Americas. Conflicts in the region increasingly saw American involvement, often justified under the principles of the doctrine. The balance of power was changing, and the United States was becoming a dominant force in the Western Hemisphere. A major turning point came during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt in the early 20th century. He introduced a new interpretation known as the Roosevelt Corp. This idea expanded the Monroe Doctrine by stating that the United States had the right to intervene in Latin American countries if they faced instability or financial crises. Roosevelt believed that such actions were necessary to prevent European intervention. However, this policy also meant that the United States could directly influence the political and economic affairs of its neighbors. It marked a significant shift from defense to active involvement, and in many cases, control. This approach became known as the Big Stick policy, based on Roosevelt's famous phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." It emphasized diplomacy backed by military strength. Under this policy, the United States carried out several interventions across Latin America. Troops were deployed, governments were influenced, and American interests became deeply embedded in the region. While some saw this as a way to maintain stability, others viewed it as a form of dominance. The Monroe Doctrine, once a shield against foreign interference, was now seen by many as a tool of American power. Over time, this approach led to growing resentment in Latin America. Many people began to question whether the United States was truly protecting the region or simply advancing its own interests. These concerns eventually led to a shift in policy during the 1930s under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. His good neighbor policy aimed to improve relations by emphasizing cooperation and non-intervention. American troops were withdrawn from several countries, and efforts were made to build partnerships based on mutual respect. For a time, this approach helped ease tensions and rebuild trust. However, the strategic importance of the Americas remained unchanged. During the Cold War, the United States once again relied on the principles of the Monroe Doctrine to justify its actions. This time, the focus was on preventing the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. The region became a key battleground in the global struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Once again, the doctrine evolved to fit the needs of a new era, demonstrating its lasting influence on international politics. Today, the legacy of the Monroe Doctrine continues to shape relationships across the Americas. Some view it as a symbol of independence and resistance against foreign control. Others see it as the beginning of a new form of dominance. What makes this story remarkable is how a single idea, introduced in a speech nearly 2 centuries ago, continues to influence global politics. It reminds us that history is not just shaped by actions, but by ideas that evolve, adapt, and endure over time. And even today, the echoes of that doctrine can still be heard in the complex relationships that define the modern world.